Meanwhile, in Israel, there is growing concern for the fate of the hostages who remain in Gaza. 136 people are thought to still be being held. Their families have been giving a press conference today in Tel Aviv. Here's a little of what was said.
We are facing a very difficult emotional situation where the heavy disaster, along with this ominous silence, has led 136 families to despair. We understand the escalation of the war due to the breach of the ceasefire by Hamas. We request a meeting with the War Cabinet to receive updates on the fate of our family members now, not tomorrow, now. If you don't have time for us, we will go to someone else and we will find the one who will represent us.
Well, listening to that with me was Iris Makler, our Jerusalem correspondent. She's live on the programme now. Iris, clearly huge anxiety for those families, but as we heard in that soundbite, anger as well.
Yes, they're angry, they're hurt, they're worried. They say that the fact that the truce broke down on Friday, they demanded a meeting with the War Cabinet. They've been told tentatively it might take place on Wednesday, so that's 5 days after their initial demand. That's not good enough. They call this a disgrace and a humiliation. And you heard that threat there. If you Israeli politicians won't talk to us, they say, we'll go and find politicians internationally who will. And I think part of the motivation or part of the anguish that we're hearing here is because of the evidence that's been emerging from some of the hostages, some of the people who were released, that is the hostages who were held by Hamas. And stories are trickling out about being ill-treated. There's no other word for it. Some of them were beaten. Some of them were beaten with electricity cables. Some of them say that two small, relatively young children under the age of 15, their thighs, their calves were burnt by a hot exhaust pipe so that if they ran away, they would be able to be identified by that scar. We have heard people saying they were separated from their families. One woman who has 3-year-old twins and who was released during this hostage deal was actually separated from one of the twins for 10 days and only found her again by identifying her cry. So these kind of stories and more stories that they don't tell, and they don't tell them because they still have relatives being held hostage there. It's a very bittersweet return when you are safe, but your husband or brother is not. So all those stories altogether are motivating this. I have to say one last thing, Nadia. Any advance on the release of hostages has only been as a result of the pressure maintained by these families nationally and internationally. Originally, when Benjamin Netanyahu declared what his war aims were, they didn't include the release of the hostages. That came only 2 weeks later after their relentless pressure. And I think that's why they're trying to bring pressure to bear now. And by the way, it has borne some fruit. The Prime Minister's office said they are considering now an earlier meeting than Wednesday, if possible.
And Iris, as we've been reporting today here, there are intensive attacks again on Gaza, that after the truce collapsed on Friday. Where do you think that leaves hopes of a more durable ceasefire? Does it, do you feel, quite far away right now?
It does feel far away. We heard from John Kirby yesterday, who wasn't talking about a durable ceasefire. He was talking about a return to this truce. He's a bit of a straight talker, the spokesperson for the UN National Security Council. And he said he doesn't know when the talks for a truce could return. And that follows the fact that the Mossad, Israel's intelligence agency, was in Qatar for only 90 minutes on Saturday before being pulled back. It looks as if the temporary truce talks are falling behind also, not to mention the larger truce. And I think the reason for that is that this truce was actually a hostage deal from the Israeli point of view. Israel would cease its fire while Hamas returned hostages, and primarily or initially women and children. That fell apart when Hamas wouldn't return women and children any longer, offered to return hostages who had died. Israel said it wanted live people to be returned, not corpses. And so that's fallen apart. And we heard from Hamas within the last 48 hours, Salah al-Aruri, a leader in Lebanon, saying, no, there won't be any more hostage discussion, any more release of hostages till after this entire conflict is over. So I would have to say to you that despite international desire for a longer term truce, you don't see it necessarily from the parties on the ground at all.